In the late 1980s, I was involved with a number of projects that were new in Madison, working with the homeless population, worked with a group that started a meal program and some of the early shelter programs, and eventually I became involved with Catholic Charities. And as I worked through some of those programs, I began to realize that the Catholic group that usually, or should have maybe dealt with some of this, was the Society of St. Vincent de Paul. And they weren't going to those meetings. They weren't really offering any help or solutions. So I thought I should go infiltrate. They had the thrift store on Williamson Street. I knew that. And so I made some contact there. And I thought I'd infiltrate them, but instead, obviously, after 35 years, they infiltrated me pretty well. And with them, I found really a home for my volunteer activities. I met some good people, but at that point, the society really was underfinanced, very small operation on Williamson Street. And so they welcomed some new person from the outside. And for several years, I was on the store committee because at that point, I was running a small bookstore. And they thought I knew something about business, and they also knew I worked with the homeless. And after several years, though, they had to let go the person managing the stores. And so I consulted with my wife, and we had decided I should apply for that position because it wasn't obvious who they would get for the salary they were offering to be able to run it. But it also needed someone who didn't just run a business, but were running something that was going to help the people that we needed to serve. And so I started out just running the one Williamson Street store, and over the years, the society really has grown, and great people came and joined the team, and we've built a great organization here now in Madison. Then I became involved nationally with some regional meetings. As I learned a number of things, I became involved as the regional representative on the national representing stores, and eventually got involved in several other national committees. And so it's been a growing process. Stayed involved with St. Vincent de Paul Society, and especially here in Madison, because I really found a home that I could use my talents. And I really saw that it was an organization that did more than just serve the poor. Most people, and myself included, join the society because we want to roll up our sleeves and help people in need. I want to help poor people. But in the process, we also learned that there's a spiritual aspect that is really reinforced by the structure of the Society of St. Vincent de Paul. And then thirdly, the friendships develop. And the last two things were elements that I did not find in other volunteer work that I did, working with meal programs and working with the homeless program. And the Society of St. Vincent de Paul's had almost 200 years of history developing that. So it was not a new idea. The tools and resources that were available have been long studied and developed. And so this, in terms of ministry to people in need, really is reinforced by the structure of the organization. Helping people in need and poverty or the homeless, it can be really burnout work. If you are just thinking you're going to solve the problems. There are difficult people to work with sometimes, very gratifying often too, but still the circumstances you're working, if you think it's just going to be relying on you without a spiritual aspect or a teamwork, it can be very frustrating. And so the structure of the organization I found to be very satisfying. And as I developed a leadership role in it, I found other friends across the whole country with similar outlooks. Some of my first involvement working with people in need and working with the meal program at Luke House started with, I had a bookstore on the campus area, and it was right above an open pantry grocery. And I started by, once in a while, homeless people would come in and ask for a sandwich, and I would go down and buy them one. And, well, the next thing I was helping like 20, 25 people a day with sandwiches. And several other people saw that there really was no meal that was being served besides one Sunday meal at a Wisconsin rescue mission. And so a number of us started what became the Luke House Meal Program. Started out of the student chapel at St. Paul's on campus, and eventually we bought our own facility on Ingersoll Street. And so that grew into a program that served 2 meals a day, 5 days a week. And, really introduced me to the needs of the men and women who were homeless. Coming out of the Vietnam War, there were a lot of homeless, drug-addicted men on the streets. It was also a time in the 1970s where they changed who was in mental institutions, and they released them onto the street with very few support services. So between the populations of veterans, people with addictions, and people with mental illness, the population of people in need really grew in those late 1970 years. Certainly, it's both been the people we serve and the people I serve with. Great stories. I should have started writing a book probably 25 years ago to include some of these stories, but I had good mentors. One of the first would have been a man called John Keyes. He started Port St. Vincent de Paul. A single man, humble, completely dedicated to the work. And as we started the meal, and some of the other programs, several of us would go to John and ask advice, and he became a friend. He died at a very young age. He died when he was 40 years old, but John just had a real sense of the people. I remember so many stories about John. One of them, we call Channel 3 did a story on Port St. Vincent de Paul about Christmas time one year, and they were there with all their cameras, kind of like we are today, and the equipment is there. And the person interviewing started off with a question asking, how many of these men here are homeless? And John stopped, he says, none of them. You're in their house. Act like you're a guest. And so he really had a whole spirit of hospitality and a way of being present to the men there that a lot of us learned from him. Lots of other stories over the years. The other person that got me involved a lot to go deeper was a regional vice president from the Milwaukee area. She started getting me involved on the national level, giving workshops and introducing me to other people in the organization to share my talents, but also to learn from those other people. Now, the people we serve are characters. Sometimes they're not easy to be with, but other times they're just heartwarming and touching. And so there's so many stories of being in people's homes and realizing that they probably had a lot more strength and resource than I did, and that how they put their lives together dealing with unfortunate situations really was inspiring. Sometimes we expect that they would be grateful, and that's a misplaced expectation very often. St. Vincent de Paul, there's a movie on him called Monsieur Vincent. It ends with a line that he may or may not have said, but he says, it's for the love you give to the poor, it's only through your love that the poor will forgive you for the bread you have to give them. A real sense of justice, and it's not our bread that we're sharing even, but it's the gifts that we've been given. So sometimes the people we serve are resentful, other times they're grateful. Interesting. One of the women who received stuff from us, but she was a regular shopper in our store. Every time she'd come in the store, I'd kind of grit my teeth because I know she'd complain about something. And even if you're giving it away, she'd complain that the clothes weren't good enough. One time she came up, and I thought, oh, here we go again. And she's going to complain about something. And she comes up to me and says, Ralph, I've been thinking a lot about things. I wanted to share this with you. She says, I'm a poor old woman, and I realize that God has given me the gift of poverty so that I could complain. How do you not love a woman who's so aware of who she is and what she is? And we both laughed together because she did like to complain. And she would not have been a very happy person if she couldn't. So, we learned from the people we were with, and they're endearing. Also great employees I've had over the years. Over the years, there were lots of times when I felt we had done meaningful work or there was reasons to celebrate. One is even the building of this building here that It serves so many people, but took a lot of effort from the community to raise the money for that. But all of the milestones that we went from 1 store to 2 stores to 3 stores, and just looking at the providence of God in all those steps. In the Society of St. Vincent de Paul, providence is something talked about often, that it's not our work, it's really the work of the Holy Spirit. And there's little times that you get signs of that, or it's obvious that you're being supported. And one of them is our very first store. Our very first store was down in Stoughton. Our second store after Willie Street. Our first expansion was the Stoughton store. And the community had asked us to come, the parish did, and even the Lutherans had looked at a thrift store and decided they weren't up to it and asked us to do it. So we bought a grocery store in Stoughton. I think we paid like $80,000 for it. But it was a bit of a risk, but we had enough money in the bank, we were able to pull that off. Well, 2 weeks later, we got a bequest for $80,000. And that happened all the time, those little pieces of providential things. You could be superstitious about it, and certainly don't mean to be that, but another story, we bought a house, it was a women's house next to the store, and an elderly woman owned it, and she always said she wanted St. Vincent de Paul to have it, to expand our women's housing operation. So she died, and the family did sell it to us at market value. And the time we got it was right before Thanksgiving. And as anyone who works with charity knows that time you're giving food baskets out, Christmas is coming, we're just a full schedule. And so we closed on it, and I changed locks on the building and said I'd figure it out after Thanksgiving. Well, the Monday after Thanksgiving, I got a call from someone who had been a lead carper from Findorf Construction, and said, I'm involved in my parish or not, but I just retired, and I'm wondering, is there any way you could use the help of a carpenter? And for the next year, I kept him busy remodeling that housing property, and it turned out beautifully. So every one of the little milestones, as if we added houses, as we added the food pantries, people came forward, donors came forward, and each milestone was meaningful. I'm particularly proud of the work we've done together, I guess would be the first thing I would share. Certainly the expansion of the food pantry, the pharmacy are all important, but more important than the projects that we've done together over the years, I'm probably most proud that I was able to bring along a lot of other great people to do the work. Even now, I've left the place in great hands, and the number of volunteers, the number of employees that are quality people is what I'm most proud of. In my position as former national president, I've said to many times, I've got to know people and programs across the whole country, and I would not trade this Madison team or these Madison volunteers with any other place in the country. I think they're that good, and they work that well together. So I also am proud that we've been innovative in many ways. We've been able to accomplish things that at first may seem not possible, but as we've worked as a team, we've done some pretty amazing things. And one of the things I said when I retired, and I was half joking, but I said when I retired, my biggest fear was that people would finally learn how little I actually did. And it really was a compliment to the people that I worked with. Certainly several things. I guess maybe the thing that's maybe most noticed by people is our free pharmacy. It's the only free pharmacy in the state that's not connected to a health clinic, where you don't need to be a patient of any health clinic to use it. And the first time I heard about such free pharmacies was from my friend in in Baton Rouge. They also had one in New Orleans, but there's several St. Vincent de Paul pharmacies across the country. We probably have more pharmacies than any other charity in the country. But I said, you can't run a pharmacy like it's a food pantry. And, it kind of you can. You just have to hire a pharmacist and have access to the drugs, but it's a great program that I certainly think is a model. The other thing I think is important is we run good thrift stores. The people shop there, enjoy it. It's a quality product. We give away a lot of the clothes, especially out of those stores, to people who need them. But it also makes funds available for other programs. And so in terms of the community, we're able to do innovative things like a pharmacy, like a microloan program, without having to wait for a specific grant or wait for some government program to fund them. If we can fund it through the profits from the thrift store, we can try it out. We can see if it works. And then maybe long-term we need to go to the community and ask for some additional help. But I think that we really serve the community by running quality thrift stores that also provide income to do services to the people in need. One of the beliefs I have about thrift stores actually is that it's a bit of holy work. Actually, St. Basil the Great had a quote that he says, "The spare coat that you have in your closet or the extra shoes you have, they really are the property of the poor." And so when we think of our consumer society, all that we have, when people clean out their closets of that excess, I think there's no better place for it to go than to serve people in need. We live in a consumer society. We all have too many things. I have too many things. But when we've used them to the extent that we want, I think it's absolutely appropriate that we turn them over to a nonprofit agency that uses them for the people who don't have too much, who do have needs for more things. So I think it's holy work to run thrift stores. One of them certainly has been engaging the students at St. Paul's University Catholic Center to do work with the Society of St. Vincent de Paul. A lot of people don't know, we were actually started by students at the Sorbonne in 1833. And so when I engaged some university students to get involved, I did home visits with them in homes of families who were asking for furniture or clothes. And when we would go out with them, I felt often that I was with those original founders, with those students. I can understand why it took off with the kind of all things are possible attitude that they had, and a certain enthusiasm. But also they had a spirituality that they had great confidence in at that young age that they could do these things and that it was important spiritual work. And their friendship was very strong. Our conferences, which is what we call our small basic unit, they're supposed to meet twice a month at minimum. Some only meet once a month. These students met every week. And they had very meaningful meetings. And so that was one of the special things, to engage with those young people and establish that. Other meaningful work was when we did the capital campaign for the facility that now has my name, which is a bit embarrassing. I would have never wanted that. As a side story, when that came up, I discouraged them strongly to do it. I said, "You wait till I die. You shouldn't name him." My wife said, had good advice. She says, "Ralph, just say thank you." But when we did this first capital campaign ever, when we built this building, we had to engage people we had never asked for help from before. And it was really meaningful to see significant people step up and get involved, including a man named Bob Cook. He was the former president of American Family Insurance, who had never chaired a capital campaign. He always thought he should not do that given his position, but he did this campaign. And I learned so much from Bob. Jeff Hausman, an insurance agent in town, recently also co-chaired that. Great people stepped up and helped us do that. And all the donors, big and small, who really were marking that they believed in the work we were doing and wanted to grow. So that was probably the most significant event of all the projects we did. Moving from being just a volunteer in the organization to taking a leadership role, I looked to several people for examples of how to proceed. One of the first was John Keyes, who was one of the first people that introduced me to the organization. And I saw his very generous, simple way of dealing with the people in need as a model that I wanted to follow. Even though I was running a business, it's really important to keep centered on why this business exists, why this organization exists. And that's to serve people in need and to serve them as equals, to serve them with dignity. And I saw that in their housing program at Port St. Vincent de Paul, and wanted to make sure as I took over leadership in the stores that we had that same attitude, that they weren't clients. We often talk about the people we serve, that they're not clients, they're our neighbors in need. And that's been an important part of the culture of St. Vincent de Paul Society. There are other people then across the country who have also been great examples. A woman, Mary Steppe from Milwaukee, the first woman to ever run for office in our National Society. She and I were great friends, and she gave me a lot of encouragement to keep expanding my knowledge and to keep trying things. And there's several other national presidents that I greatly admire. Humble men with a lot of talent, humble men and women. We only had one woman national president, but they're all people that are to be admired in many ways. I also needed to learn how to run it as a business, and we've had several people on our board of directors who, during the frustrating times, would be there to give good advice, to say we're on the right track. It wasn't always easy either. There were several times where their finances were very tough. There's sometimes, as I would say, we flew pretty close to the trees sometimes. And some of the projects weren't immediate successes. And the support that I received from our board was always unequivocal. I mean, some of the projects, as they were looking like they weren't going to succeed, we owned them together. I see some organizations where you would blame the leader for the failure, or you would you have second judgment of things. You wanted to second guess people. Our board never did that. We always said, we decided this together. May have been the right decision, may have been the wrong decision, but we all owned it. And in the end, they all worked. It was some of those community leaders that were, I was lucky enough to have on my board of directors that were also my mentors. After my national presidency was finished, I thought I'd probably just retire back to doing home visits and working with my conference, but I was asked by our current international president, Juan Manuel Gomez from Spain, to be his vice president. Right as my term ended, there were international elections and he was new in office. And he and I had become friends over the year because he was president of Spain and I was president of the USA, and we'd often be at meetings together. And I found him a very thoughtful person, and I assume he must have found me a useful friend as well in negotiating some of the international politics. And there are politics in the organization, but I always found him one who valued the spirituality and friendship above some of the power or authority you might think you get when you're an international leader. And one of the things that I've shared several times about him that has left the biggest impression is on the international board, sometimes we have to deal with very difficult situations in countries around the world where they aren't functioning well. Maybe there's some conflict between the president and their members or their boards, or even between them and church leaders. And so we were dealing with one of these situations, and after about 10, 15 minutes of different sides of the problem being presented, he stopped us and he said, "Where's the friendship in this? Why are we doing this if it's not for the spirituality and friendship?" And that's not what you usually hear at a board of directors meeting, but it told me who he was and why I'm happy to be working with him. The Society of St. Vincent de Paul has been blessed with leadership throughout the years here. One of the person who was very active in the 50s and 60s was a man called Mr. Myers. I don't remember his first name, but he ran a butcher shop on Williamson Street. And he, as a side, really helped us buy the building that was part of the Williamson Street store. and very active running that operation on a volunteer basis for many years. And he was an absolutely critical person in that time. Since then, there have been multiple people. I would say John Keyes, who I respect greatly, who ran Port St. Vincent de Paul, was an important leader in the Society of St. Vincent de Paul. Another person that was very active in the society and provided great leadership was also the Dane County Sheriff, Franz Haas. Franz was a very active member at St. James Parish, but he brought a certain sense of leadership. When Franz presided over a meeting, there was no doubt who was in charge. Franz was. He had a generous heart, but he was also a bit of a character and an authoritarian man, but got us through some rough years. Another woman who provided good leadership in our organization was Alice Selo. Alice Selo was actually John Keyes' sister. John ran Port St. Vincent de Paul. And Alice was the first director of our food pantry when it was located on Williamson Street. And she was both a volunteer for many years and then an employee that I worked with for about 15 years. And she was someone who was well respected by the people we served. And she's the one who taught me how to do the home visits. I've mentored many people myself on home visits since then, but Alice is the one who took me on my first home visits. And she could ask hard questions of the people we served. And they all took it. She was like an aunt to them. And no matter what their race or where they're from, she was always respected by them. And I learned a lot from her in terms of how to work with people. We would sometimes be in homes where they'd ask for some furniture. We'd go to places with no mattresses, kids sleeping on floors. These are the kind of visits we would do all the time. So that's why they asked us to come to their house to give them some voucher for mattresses. And next thing I knew, Alice was opening the refrigerator. She was looking in the cupboards, and she says, "There's no food in here. What are you going to feed your kids tonight?" I thought, well, that's a lot of nerve. What are you doing? I would not have done that, and I didn't do that like she did. I couldn't get away with that, but she did, and she was the next thing, telling them where to get food that night. If they didn't have pots and pans to cook the food, or she was writing down this, "I'm not going to give you just mattresses. I'm going to give you some pots and pans. Do you have a can opener?" They didn't even have can openers sometimes to open the cans we'd give them for food. And so someone like Alice had a way she could get away with things that I couldn't, but it did teach me the things I needed to ask in my own way, and to really take people on as individual people, and to not just see them as clients, to not just write vouchers like a doctor writing a prescription, but to really engage people to find out what they need, what's their lived experience, what their families are experiencing, and if there's a way St. Vincent de Paul can help, we'll do that. We do home visits, which most charities don't do, and there's a certain amount of sensitivity you need to have when you go to people's homes. Many of the people are very grateful that you don't do that in the office. Others, they worried a little bit about their privacy. I did it with students, and you'd think, well, can you have a college student do such a thing? And college students are mature enough to do that. And I would always be reminded, well, our founders did that, and they were college students. But no matter who they are, we do training in advance. And some of the training is what we can and can't do. You don't want to ever overpromise and underperform when you do these visits. It's also important not to be judgmental. For many of these people we visited, this is the first time they had their own apartment. They had been homeless sometimes, so to compliment them on their nice spot, to acknowledge the children. But there were all other things that it was tough not to be judgmental. When their kids are sleeping on the floor with no mattresses and there's a color TV in the living room, it's tough not to be judgmental. But I'd say we found that probably in 50% of the places we went. But if you step back from it, if I had 3 kids and I'm a single mom, first thing I get is a television, because for better or worse, it's the babysitter. But it also might be the only form of entertainment they have. Also, you don't know how they got it, and very many times we go into houses and find the rent-to-own furniture there, be it a TV or other things, and the rent-to-own is a very abusive system that people are paying way over market price for the rental of the stuff they have. And in some ways, it's taking advantage of the people that we were serving. And so sometimes, if we found out it was, gently, we would ask them, do you know how much you're paying? And maybe you need to rethink this. And so going into the home is sensitive, but we do train people, and we found college students who are certainly capable of doing this. The Society of St. Vincent de Paul has an interesting history, being founded by young college students at the Sorbonne in 1833. If you think about it, that's not long after the French Revolution, and it took a couple of remarkable young men to have this vision. Religious people were tolerated at that point in France, but really weren't seen favorably, especially in institutions like the Sorbonne. And so these young men found each other, and they decided they wanted to put their faith in action, not just debate it or go to church, but they saw that the gospel really asked them to serve the poor. And Frederick Ozanam was a very bright young man. He went on to become a lawyer. He wasn't that pleased. He became a lawyer because his dad wanted him to, quite frankly. But the practice of law he found not being satisfying to what he wanted to do. He eventually became a professor of literature at the Sorbonne. But his biggest talent, I think, was to engage other people to see the vision, to see the possibility. And he says he wanted to form a network of charity. And so if it hadn't been for his vision, we might have just been a nice group of college students that graduated and went on their way. So as Frederick would look here in Madison, he'd probably fault us for not having enough young people. He'd see that we are not doing enough to engage college students and young adults, young professionals, and that's difficult. But he'd be very pleased to see all of what we do here. One of the sayings of our founders, not just Frederick, but it was documented enough that the saying that they had was, there is no work of charity foreign to the work of the Society of St. Vincent de Paul. So he'd be very pleased to see pharmacies and microloans, to see housing, and to see the thrift stores and all these different things. Because that wisdom of no work of charity being foreign really, I think, accounts for its spread. The Society of St. Vincent de Paul is not the same in Milwaukee as it is in Madison. And from international experience, I can tell you it's not the same in Brazil or India, where we have very large membership, as it is here in Madison, Wisconsin. But there's serious work to be done in all these communities. And so that vision of his, to see that network of charity, I think he'd be very pleased with this society today in all these countries. There's lots of works that need to be done in Madison. Some of them, the St. Vincent de Paul Society is positioned to do, others there aren't. I'd say whatever we do, it's important to keep having that personal contact, be it volunteers or staff. That's the first hallmark of us. It's not just to hire social workers or people to get things done, but it's to do it in having personal relationships. In terms of the needs of this community, none is bigger than the housing problems. We've actually had to let go of our housing for men and women because the demands of the economics of it and other things, at this point, it was not a ministry we were performing well. It'd be nice if we could get back into it, but if not, we need to keep finding ways to be supportive of the many people in our community that find ourselves without proper housing, and many without any housing at all. So I think that's one of the big ongoing challenges for the whole city. And I hope the Society of St. Vincent de Paul keeps being part of it. Right now, our services to the homeless are through some counseling for women or some mentoring programs we have for women. And many of the other services we offer might not be directly housing people, but they help them provide the funds so they can have money to pay the bills. That's why our food pantry is so busy. The first bill any family pays is going to be their rent. And the money they have left through the rest of that month is what they will buy food and transportation with. And that's why in many ways the food pantry is helping pay rent. Other things we can do, I don't have the vision to see what they are. I'm sure that the people we've put in place will continue to see what the needs are, and I have great trust in them. The one piece of advice I would give to those who are going to be part of the second century of the society is to keep in close contact with the roots of the society. The roots have nurtured us. Roots nurture trees, they nurture plants, and our roots also nurture us. And those roots are founded in a spirituality that trusts in the Holy Spirit to give us what we need, and for us to really be the face of God in our communities, to be the face of care and love in our communities, and to have that spirituality nurture you, because it could be burnout work, working with people in need. Then the other two values of friendship are equally important, the friendship and the service. The service needs to be done with dignity, with respect for the people we serve, to see them as equals, to see them as people that are in an unfortunate situation. And friendship then, you have to do it as a team. Every so often, in the past, there were people in our community, some men, who people would know as Mr. St. Vincent de Paul. I never wanted to be Mr. St. Vincent de Paul. I hope no one ever sees me as that, because that means I have failed to build a team, if one person is. And I think that to build a team is the most valuable thing you can do as a leader. And I see that we really, in this community, have a culture in the Society of St. Vincent de Paul that embodies all of those: to serve the people with dignity, to be rooted in spirituality, and to do it as a team of friends.